Guardian. Will picked up Robert Polsky's thrift shop suit from the dry cleaners and walked down Queen Street West on that late summer morning. The suit held aloft in its plastic wrap. Will's hair was now cut short and he was clean-shaven. He wore a dark pinstripe suit, a conservative money suit. He wore a crisp white shirt and a crimson silk tie. This was just another business day for him. Polsky, too. Will opened the door at the Dolphin and the wind chime sounded. He said hello to Dorothy, and he said hello to Fred, the owner, who was busy cleaning the grill, his cooking whites stained from the breakfast rush. Will had spent a lot of money in the Dolphin, despite being a non-drinker, and Fred had taken to greeting him as a valued customer, a regular. Dorothy was now more tolerant of Robert. Fred had probably had a talk with her. Polsky brought money to the Dolphin. Cobb and Will made sure of this. They also made sure he was well taken care of. What with his suit, tobacco, pocket money. Polsky was their CEO. They were 110987 Ontario, Inc. Will passed the suit to Robert, who took it to the bathroom. Will slid into the booth and Dorothy came over. Will ordered a coffee and a fried egg sandwich on dry, whole wheat toast. He was eating again. Robert came out in his suit at the same time Will's sandwich arrived at the table. Will ate quickly, paid, said goodbye to Dorothy, then he and Polsky left for the Royal Bank. The nearest branch of the Royal Bank, the former Merchants' Bank of Halifax, founded in 1864, as Will explained to Robert, was 7 blocks from the Dolphin. The bank had been started by a small group of Haligonians, true collectivists who put their money together in order to build up the fishing and lumber industries. The irony of it all, Will told Robert on the way to the bank, was that the fish were almost gone, and so was most of the hardwood, but the Royal Bank was bigger than ever. Will had plenty of time to go over their story with Robert. It was simple and true. Robert Polsky had, by law, a handicap. He had a psychological disorder. He was legally required to follow his prescription. His mind was quarantined behind antipsychotic drugs that reshuffled consciousness. A guardian was not a difficult concept for a bank manager to understand. These kinds of arrangements were common. Will explained to Robert he was his guardian. They entered through the main door and walked over to the counter. A young woman with black hair and olive skin smiled and listened to their inquiry. She raised a finger delicately and begged a moment's patience while she went to get the right person. A couple of minutes later, a Mr. Kenny was in front of them with his hand extended in greeting. Robert and Will shook his hand. Mr. Kenny was young, but bald. He had a thick, dark mustache. He had the beady little eyes of a rodent. He, like Will, wore a dark pinstripe suit. He couldn't have been much older than 30. Mr. Kenny escorted them to the back of the bank and into the office. Mr. Kenny asked what he could do for them. Will explained it to him. Robert, Will explained, wanted to open a corporate account. The president and chief executive officer was Robert Polsky. Robert was a schizophrenic under Will's care by way of the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. At the behest of the Ministry of Justice, Robert had come into some money by way of death in the family, and the lawyers for the estate hired him, William Tobe, to invest the funds and manage the assets resulting from the trust. Robert Polsky had already incorporated and had his articles of incorporation. It was feared by the estate lawyers that, should Robert govern his affairs without guidance, he might find himself in trouble. The volume of capital to be dispersed to him on a bi-weekly basis was substantial, the dividend of a large trust. The reporting and accounting of these sums had to be undertaken by a qualified person. Will showed Mr. Kenny the letter of guardianship from the lawyer representing the estate of which Robert was the sole beneficiary. The letterhead was none other than A.E. Campbell, Q.C. Mr. Polsky, as Will explained to Mr. Kenny in the detached tone of one accustomed to managing large sums of money, was quite well off. The lawyers managed the trust. William Tobe was simply to manage the flow of dispersals from the trust. Mr. Kenny made some elementary sales pitches. The bank had a number of products which could prove beneficial. Anticipating this and knowing it would further his credibility, Will had structured a monthly cash flow, and he allowed for the bank's participation. 15% of the bi-weekly dispersal was to be invested in a medium-sized fund of the bank's choice. 10% was to be invested in indemnified bonds of the bank's choosing. 10% was to be invested in the blue chip stocks through the bank's wealth management branch. 10% was to be allocated to a currency fund, also of the bank's choosing. The percentages would be reviewed quarterly. The automatic withdrawal forms were drawn up immediately, and Robert signed them where Will placed his index finger. The rest of the money would serve to cover the expenses of the beneficiary, Robert Polsky, and to facilitate his own investment wishes, which, according to Will, centered on ecology and conservation in Latin America. Mr. Kenny smiled and nodded his head a lot. He left the office once to photocopy the letter of guardianship, Robert's birth certificate, social insurance card, and the articles of incorporation for 1109897 Ontario, Inc. In one of the silences, when Will had his head bent to a form he was proofreading, Robert looked at Mr. Kenny and said, "Moses was an economist by my interpretation." "My goodness, that's a remarkable thought, Mr. Polsky, sir." They finished their business in less than half an hour. They shook hands. Robert and Will left. Will had the account documents and an ATM card for 1109897 Inc. End of chapter.